to Craig Air Froce Base, and we are getting ready to take off. Got the ground crew here, as I have in the past. My wife and my son Matthew, he's home from college for Christmas. I've laid out my gear, and the airport manager just came out and offered me the opportunity to lift off from the airport. And we had just been out there and looked at it, and since it was all concrete, I didn't see a grassy area. I thought maybe we would do better here, and so I'll be lifting off in that direction, which I think will be fine. We'll document the airfield as it's been and talk about it while we're up there. And okay, so I've looked over the paramotor. A little bit earlier I made sure that we were good for our screws and such are tight, pins are in everywhere, and about ready to go ahead and hop on in and lock her up. My son has pointed out that I've set up a little bit under a wire, so I'm going to try to pull forward pretty quick to get out from under it as the parachute comes up, and hopefully everything will work fine. We'll see. So here we go. Okay, so if you can hear me, that is the old Craig Air Froce Base housing that we're looking at there. It's actually cut off from the base now to make it private. And then I'm turning to the right. I'm going to take a look at the base airport. Now, many of these buildings are still being used, which accounts for their high state of maintenance. So that's something that sometimes doesn't happen to an old base, but it has happened here. They brought in some industry, and the other things are kept in caretaker status, so that's kind of nice. But got an airplane landing, taxiing in, and we're going to fly around to the other side of the base, going to fly around the edge, and then we're going to check out the further buildings. But this was once a very active base with began in 1940 with pilot training, and pilot training at that time was about 7 months long. It was still peacetime, but then of course the war began, and when the war began, pilot training was sped up, and they put a lot of pilots through here. This is one of the first Air Force bases, if not the first, for World War II that did major training for single engine aircraft, that is fighters, think of it that way. And they not only trained Americans here, but they trained a number of English. You know, of course it was difficult to train in England, so they trained English pilots here. And of the 9,000 pilots that were trained here during World War II, more than 1,400, or approximately 1,400 of them were in fact Royal Air Force pilots. So that's a lot of folks. So I'm flying around the edge of the airfield, and I want to make sure that I'm low and not disturbing any landing airplanes. as we head on over to the other side. Now this out here now is off of the reservation, so to speak, off of the civilian area of the airport. It's been fenced off, and this taxiway area and so forth is no longer being used by the airport. Yeah, it's no longer being used by the airport, or what was the Air Force Base. Today it is used for other things. They put some industry out here, and again, that accounts for the good state of the buildings that we see. So this is the road I actually drove by to discover Craig Air Force Base, and when I first drove by here. So I don't know what the businesses are here, but it looks like they're fairly prosperous. And it could be that some of these things were added later. Of course, these buildings as they are, they're most likely old Air Force bases, because old Air Force buildings, because they look so much like them. I was in the Air Force for over 20 years and in the military altogether for 31. National Guard, Marine Corps, and Army, National Guard, and active duty in Marine Corps, and active duty Air Force. And other buildings look as if maybe, you know, they are new. I just don't know. This one has been built where the railroad line actually goes into the building. Now that doesn't seem like something that a civilian company would do. Now I might be wrong, but I don't think so. So this probably, because it's so close to the airfield, this is probably old hangars and supply buildings and maintenance buildings and such. It's a really pretty place. Selma, Alabama was a good place to be assigned, it seems to me, if you like the country life. Now, going back a few years, of course, you know, this was closed in '73, put into caretaker status in 1977. You see the deer down there. I don't know if you can see them. I'm going to let off the gas and come in. You see them on the railroad track, right in the middle. You see them? One of them will cross the railroad track here in a second. There it goes. Here's another. But in 1965, that was quite a year for the town of Selma, Alabama. As you might know, we're not too far from the Edmond Pettus Bridge, which we're going to try to fly over to when we leave the Air Force Base here. In 1965, on March 7th, a group of about 600 peaceful protesters for civil rights at the time decided they were going to march from the Brown Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church, and they were going to march from there across the Edmond Pettus Bridge in Selma and down Highway 14 until they arrived at the Capitol steps of Montgomery, Alabama. Now remember, this is 1965, so Jim Crow South, segregation, all of that is going on. Well, they had just gotten 6 blocks. They had gotten to the Edmond Pettus Bridge when they ran into a collection of both state and local police officers who were in riot gear and with billy clubs, and began to tear gas them, beat them, and drive them back to stop this protest. Well, now that was being shown, the news was covering this event, and ABC News was covering something about the German war criminals and killing and the mistreatment of the Jews in Germany that evening. And so at the same time that they're showing this Nazi Germany film of their atrocities, ABC News cuts in and begins to show pictures of Americans treating other Americans in this way, as Germans treated German Jews. White Americans were treating black Americans in this very, very awful attack on their person and their liberty. Well, this was something I suppose the whites didn't want to, the Southern whites didn't want to see happen again. So 2 days later, Martin Luther King, he staged a symbolic march just from the Brown's Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church to the Edmond Pettus Bridge. Of course, they weren't challenged that time. And President Johnson, he went on television and he began to talk about how this was a terrible thing, and this was a moment in history in which there was the energy and there was the conviction to do something about the civil rights abuses in America, you know, segregation and Jim Crow laws. And they went to court here in Selma, and they got a hold of a Judge Jackson. Can't remember his first name right now, but Judge Jackson, he looked at the situation, and the argument, you know, there's always an argument that's made by those who would oppress others, and their argument was that they were impeding traffic. They were impeding traffic. Now, I suppose traffic was inconvenienced, but this was a much bigger issue than traffic on any given day, and the judge decided that that is exactly what they were going to do. They were going to put the civil rights of these people, which was a very high priority, over the, you know, one day's traffic. And so, as a result, the judge's order and the president brought in regular Army troops and nationalized the Alabama National Guard, and they protected them 7 days after the first march when they were beaten, when 25,000 people arrived. By the time they got there, 25,000 people arrived at the Capitol steps. Now, they didn't start out 25,000 strong, but they grew, and they slept in fields along the way as they went, and more joined them until finally, when they got to the Capitol steps, there were 25,000 people. So here is a private hangar which still has airplanes. Look like they do maintenance here, and you can see the airplanes here. And I'm sure that this is an old building that was once part of the Air Force Base, and so anyway, the Alabama National Guard, filled with a bunch of folks who probably didn't want to, were charged with keeping the peace and protecting these peaceful protesters, and that's exactly what they did, along with the regular army. And shortly later that year, about 7 months later, Voting Rights Act was passed, and it ensured that people, regardless of their color, race, so forth, religion, would have the opportunity to vote. And that was because of the power to vote and the power to determine your leaders. It's said to be the most powerful piece of civil rights legislation that was passed. So here we are, coming back over to the Craig Air Force Base housing, the old housing that's now civilian. It was all sold to individuals. And you can see that some of it has not fared well, as you can see as we come up to this home right here. These are what were apartments. There's holes in the roof. They were never maintained. Now, they would have been in great shape when they were turned over, but for some reason the money wasn't there, and ultimately they were abandoned. Now, they could have been bought by an apartment or rental company that decided they were going to rent these things out, which when they weren't rented, and perhaps the company decided not to do the work to take care of them, that could explain that. So now on Craig Air Force Base, if you see these large white buildings, long white buildings, used to be barracks. Well, today that is where the Alabama Correctional Institute, Educational Institute, trains new corrections officers, and the Alabama Highway Patrol also trains here, although not in that building. They train a little bit further down. But these buildings they're not going to stand up if the roofs are allowed to go, and that one's been allowed to go for a long time. So these are all Air Force buildings, of course, that were used on garrison side. We're actually going to see the chapel here. I was a chaplain for 28 years altogether, but in the Army and the Air Force together. But we're flying directly toward the chapel, and you can see the steeple perhaps there as we come up directly on it. We're aiming right at it. It's a white building beyond these 2 or 3 buildings in the front. Coming up behind it, we're not facing the front. So I've actually lifted off a little early today. It's winter, the sun is, it's kind of cloudy today, and so there is more of the buildings that are being used by the state police right here and over here.
Hey, Dave from the future here. We're over on the side of the base where the commissary, the BX, the main headquarters building would have been, here on the garrison side. And we've been looking around, and we had an opportunity to explain what went on at the Selma Bridge in the civil rights movement. But as I went over there, you know, the video of the bridge that was in your bottom left-hand corner was pretty much the bulk of what I could get. I had to skirt the town in order to stay away from the congested area. So once I went over the bridge and turned to the right to come around to the other side of town, there wasn't a whole lot to show. So I think I'm going to go ahead and let it go with what I've already done. And then, of course, the video is 20 minutes long. So I hope you enjoyed it. And I think that it's kind of neat to see these things in history and their impact on us today. So I hope you enjoyed both Craig Air Force Base and the civil rights background. God bless.
So I think that I'm ready to land. The problem is I can't land in there because that entire area is fenced, I'm now noticing, and gated. So I can't land there. I'm going to have to land over here. Got our gear out here. Got some friends coming up to say hello. And
we had to come see it up close, man.
Got to give the wife a call and let her know where I'm at and come pick me up.